Hi, welcome to my quote-unquote TED Talk, the podcast edition. I'm Catherine Pearsall. I want to talk about uncertainty reduction theory, URT, and how I got to apply my knowledge of it to a real-world experience in real time. I began this Theories of Communication class in January of this year, and I knew that part of the requirement for my course was to mindfully apply communication theory to a real-world situation. I was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of theories that we were studying, especially because I don't have a communication background. But Chuck Berger's uncertainty reduction theory, it popped out at me almost immediately. And then in February of this year, a month later, I had my first meeting with my new director, Scott. He's an executive in our company, and this was the perfect opportunity to apply my theory. I want to start out by saying that while applying the theory to a real-time situation was fascinating all by itself, what was really intriguing to me was that knowing the theory about reducing uncertainty, the hows, the whys, the nuts and bolts, it didn't reduce my uncertainty itself. Knowing the theory didn't stop me from living the full experience, meaning I was still uncertain, I was still nervous and anxious, but I had this unique chance to simultaneously live an experience and observe it against a communication theory. That said, in the weeks prior to meeting Scott, I found that I was naturally engaging in what Berger referred to as information-seeking strategies. He has 4 of them: passive, active, extractive, and interactive. And it was fascinating to watch it all happening and to be able to link it back to theory. Passive information seeking is pretty much like it sounds. It's essentially just observation. And I had the chance to observe Scott in a couple of large-scale meetings after the announcement was first made. And I noticed he didn't smile very much, and it concerned me. I hoped it was just his nerves at the transfer and the announcement and everything, and it didn't portend a negative demeanor, but that's all the information I had about him. So the active strategy involves looking to other people for information, and I was doing that as well. I reached out to his previous chief of staff, with whom I've worked in the past, and that was going to be my role with Scott going forward. And I asked her for the scoop on Scott, and she raved about him. It was consistent with information I've been getting from my current director, from people in outside organizations contacting me. People are congratulating me on getting to work with Scott. So they're all giving me this input that Scott's very laid back. They use the word zen to describe him. But he's really sharp, and he's warm, and he's friendly. So that was a relief. I was happy to get that information. The extractive strategy involves online research, essentially. And I did look him up in the company website, and I scanned his bio and all of that as soon as I heard that he was announced. But I'm really more interested in the person, how we'll work together, how their personality and their style is going to impact our culture, that kind of thing, as opposed to specific accomplishments or job roles. So I didn't spend a lot of time looking into online resources. But then it was time for our face-to-face meeting, and that's my chance to engage in interactive strategy. To prepare Scott, I had an literal armful of information to give him. I had this big notebook, and it was full of just basic foundational information. It has executive org chart structures and how he fits in and how all the other players fit in together. It had our meeting cadence and our financials and our metrics and all that run the business information. Huge notebook. And then I was also armed for this introduction with URT. So I could appreciate my anxiety. It didn't make my anxiety about the meeting go away, URT, but I was aware of it as a function of uncertainty. I was also aware that Scott was likely going to be a lot more anxious than I am because he's coming in cold to this new organization, twice the size of his previous group. We have a much more intense production system, so I thought he's got to be a little anxious himself. But regardless, I was aware of my own nervousness. And in these situations, I tend to rely on kindness and humor, and our meeting that day was no exception. I walked in grinning with a warm "Hi, boss," and a chuckle, and he smiled and motioned me to sit down. And I did, and I pulled the notebook and all this material in front of me on his desk. But what I found interesting was the ability to be able to apply URT in that moment. And I felt like my brain, it was full. I wasn't sharp. I was nervous. I didn't know what direction to take the conversation or how. I knew this could go a million different ways, and I had no idea how to prepare for what. And I was also feeling the pressure of wanting him to like me. To that point, Berger describes three influencing factors in URT that we're especially interested in reducing our uncertainty if we know we'll be seeing this new person again. Check, he's my boss. If they have something that we need or we want. Check, I need him to approve of me and my work because, again, he's the boss. And if they're behaving in an odd way, which luckily didn't apply in this case. So while I was feeling the pressure because I wanted his approval, I simultaneously wanted to be authentic and warm and helpful, but then I didn't want to come across like a sycophant. So all of that cognitive noise was swirling in my head, and it was most definitely impeding any sense of grace in my speech. But luckily, Scott is smoother than I am. He turned away from his computer when I sat down, and he turned towards me with his full body. He sat back in his chair and loosely crossed one ankle over his knee, and he had his arms out to his sides. His body language was completely trusting and open and relaxed. He was the picture of nonverbal warmth. I felt a little bit of easing of my anxiety at that. It was like a confirmation that he's kind and that I'm going to be okay with him. One of Berger's URT axioms is that increasing nonverbal warmth decreases uncertainty, and that definitely happened for me. So Scott started off asking me how long I've been on our program, and I gave him the 10-second history of my tenure. I was anxious, so I kept it pretty high level and brief. I didn't want to bore him, and I didn't know how much he really wanted to know, but he listened attentively, and then he told me about his history. And he was really storytelling. It was relaxed, it was warm, and it felt like a way that he was not only establishing background information, but it was like a sense of connection. And it was an interesting example of him inviting disclosure, asking me to share about me, and then offering a deeper self-disclosure, which I could then take as an invitation to go deeper myself, which I did. And disclosure and that reciprocity is all a part of the interactive strategy that Berger outlines. A few more of the URT axioms came into play as we were talking, and it was interesting to feel the visceral reaction because it's described clinically in a study as you would expect, but I could almost physically feel it. For example, Scott's worked with one of my previous directors, and his face lit up when I mentioned Dennis. And because I really like Dennis too, I felt a stronger connection with Scott immediately. And it was like an example of how our shared network decreased my uncertainty and increased my liking for him. But like I said, it was a visceral reaction. I could feel an almost, it was like a sense of warmth maybe, or blooming almost. It's hard to describe. But it was a moment where I could identify that our networks were connected, and it was a sense that Scott and I were a part of the same whole. That measurably decreased my sense of uncertainty with him. And in the last few minutes we were together, he pulled the work materials over, and we spent a little bit of time reviewing it, and then that was it. It's about a 20-minute meeting altogether. But what I found really helpful in having this particular example of uncertainty reduction theory was a study that Michael Kramer published in 1993 on uncertainty reduction in job transferees. My my conversation with Scott, it almost followed Kramer's study as though it were a script. It's pretty logical. It's pretty intuitive, the things that Kramer put forward. He said that coworkers at a new location, their typical initial interactions include background and interests and family, and move on to work procedures and work environment. That's essentially the order in which Scott and I discussed all those topics. Then transferees also spend time clarifying task details and processes and working relationships in order to reduce their own uncertainty, which makes total sense. They need to understand who they're working with and what the job is. The notebook that I brought in, it had all of that. And he was actively excited by seeing that notebook. His energy perked up. And I imagine it was likely helping reduce his own uncertainty. And I also think it gave him a sense of my role, of leading the tactical operations of the organization and what I can offer him. So it might have been reducing not only his uncertainties about his own role, but any uncertainties he had about mine. Something that happened since our first meeting is that he scheduled what he's calling an onboarding session with the rest of the leadership team. Kramer wrote about transferees helping to lower uncertainty for their new coworkers by sharing things like their previous work location and experience, clarifying their job procedures and relational parameters, and then things like communities and families and interests. And honestly, that's the agenda for the onboarding session that Scott designed. He's going to discuss his own background, his work style and preferences and expectations. Then he's engaging the full leadership team in a discussion of where we all think the organization needs to focus and the role that Scott should play in that. So the punchline of all of this is that having the opportunity to actively view a real-time situation through the lens of a given theory is fascinating, and it's almost a tactical way to learn it. It allows somebody, like me in this case, to actually live a study. And though knowing URT didn't reduce my uncertainty about Scott specifically, it reduced my uncertainty about reducing my uncertainty about Scott. Fascinating. Thanks so much for listening.